give this talk on inequality dynamics, dynamics amidst rapid growth, a post-liberalization Indian perspective. We have with us today Sriram Balasubramaniam, Dr. Prakash Longani, and Rishabh Kumar. Let me just give a brief introduction to the speakers, and then I'll talk a little bit about the modalities in terms of Q&A, and then we can get started with the presentation. So Dr. Longani is an assistant director and a senior personnel manager in the IMF's Independent Evaluation Office. He has published extensively on economic growth and inequality. He has published a book on confronting inequality, how societies can choose inclusive growth. And previously he headed the macroeconomics division in the International Monetary Fund's research department. And he is also an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins University and a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. Sriram Balasubramaniam is a senior research officer in the IMF's Independent Evaluation Office, and he has worked with the World Bank and other multilateral organizations and also in the private sector. And he is interested in macroeconomic policy, growth dynamics, and emerging socio-political trends, among other topics. Rishabh Kumar is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He was an economist for the city of New York, and he's received his PhD from the New School for Social Research recently. And he has many publications in the area of historical inequality in India. So before we start the talk, let me just mention some modalities of the Q&A. All the questions will be on the chat window. The audience will be muted throughout. After the first about 15-20 minutes, we'll have a small break for where the presenter can answer questions. And then we'll have another longer Q&A at the end of the talk. So if you have to ask any questions, please do it on the chat window. And and the presenters will be happy to take your questions. So with that, let me turn over the floor to Sriram. Thank you for being with us at IIM Ahmedabad, and I'm sure it will be a very interesting presentation. Thank you.
I hope you're seeing the presentation.
Yes, it's visible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Sanket, for providing the opportunity. We're grateful that we could share some of the findings from our research at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. And I'm also thankful to Professor Satish Deodar for facilitating this as well. And a standard disclaimer before we begin the presentation. The views in this paper and the presentation are the authors alone. They do not represent the views of the IMF, its executive board, or the Independent Evaluation Office, or any other organization. And as the title suggests, we are going to talk about inequality dynamics and rapid growth and migration in India, as sort of a summarized perspective from the 1990s, post-liberalization, till about till the recent trends that we see. The outline of the presentation is primarily we are focusing on two basic questions. The first of which is how much inequality in India is determined by based on a person's location alone, mainly how interstate and rural-urban dynamics explain to some extent a distribution of living standards. This is one of the moot questions that we try to address in our research. The next question is the ongoing effort to create more updated consumption data and analyze the relationships between transformative schemes such as the DBT and the changes to inequality in recent years, especially post 2012 phase, and some of the trends that we're seeing on this. And we also try to use this to assess the pandemic induced lockdown and the reverse migration trends. We approach this through a couple of papers that we've been working on, and the presentation is a summation of the analysis that we see from these papers. What we basically study is, first we use two variants of the India's consumption surveys published by the NSSO. Our data, or the NSSO's official data, ends in about 2011-12, coinciding with the latest census. Obviously, I think the viewers are probably cognizant of the controversy around the 2017-18 league survey. We are not really, venturing into that since it's not official inputs, but we try to see some trends along the way in recent times. We also employ microdata for the 2011-12 to analyze the importance of circumstances, which we define later in the paper and in the presentation. And we also develop PPP terms, adjusted long-run series from the World Bank's POCAL and database, comparative purposes, time and country. This is more essential, especially when you do comparisons with countries like India, with countries like China and Indonesia, as we progress in the presentation. POCAL and database is one of the more comprehensive data series that is used for inequality analysis. How this differs from the existing literature, I think that's a moot point that most folks would be interested in. I think the discourse on inequality in India has transformed in recent times. In probably the 90s and early 2000s, it's more about whether growth can lift all ships and alleviate inequality by itself, or inclusive growth is the domain that needs to be looked at, and the quality of growth is more important than the quantum of growth. I think in recent times, the discussion has moved towards some of the research, say, Thomas Piketty has articulated, and ours differs in the sense that we're not focusing on the evolution of the top decile shares, which is popularized by Piketty et al., focused on the rich and the role of taxation and policy. We don't use tax data primarily for a variety of reasons, but majorly because the 2000 to 2009 series is still not publicly available as well. So that makes it a bit more challenging for us. So we don't focus on the evolution of the top decile shares. We also do not focus on socioeconomic determinants such as caste and gender, where substantial work already exists in the literature. And our approach is to use consumption as a proxy for living standards to assess how location will be important at the level of individuals. And a large part of our work is also inspired from Branko Milanovic's Global Inequality of Opportunity paper and the model that was described there. And we try to simulate that in the Indian context from a state-centric perspective. As we shall also see, this also proves to be key in the current pandemic crisis and some of the trends that we're seeing in the recent crisis. The first set of silas facts, I think, which will be important for the listener to be cognizant about, is the comparison with which India has with China and Indonesia. It's important to note that we are focusing on consumption Gini, consumption surveys here. Generally, the Gini comparisons that we see includes a combination of both consumption and income surveys. But to be a bit more precise and accurate in our analysis, we made sure that the comparison was purely on consumption Gini. As you see in the graphs, the inequality in China, for example, is driven largely by rural inequality. The rural inequality drives the national aggregate trends compared to urban inequality. Whereas in the case of, say, Indonesia and more in the case of India, you see that the urban inequality is actually driving the national aggregate, much less the rural inequality. So we see this in the Gini indices, in the consumption indices, that urban inequality is one of the drivers of aggregate inequality, at least in India's case, in comparison with other countries. From the Gini, we go to the growth incidence curves. The GIC curve essentially measures growth at each decile over a period on an annual basis. We have percentage annual growth of consumption, $PPP on the y-axis, consumption deciles on the x-axis. And what we are trying to show here is that, again, the trends that we saw in the Gini seems to be replicated here as well in the GIC, where you see the urban inequality, the gap between the 10th decile in urban India and the first decile is probably the biggest gap that you see among the other trends in the graph. So that indicates almost 1.25% gap between the urban top and the urban bottom deciles. And much of the national aggregate is also driven by urban GIC trends. And as you see, the rural inequality seems to be lesser compared to the urban inequality over this time phase between 1983 and 2011. And a third set of facts for to give us a context is the top the bottom share, the top 10% and the bottom 40%. If you have noticed, I think the trends seem to be gradually increasing at the national aggregate level, driven largely by the urban push, much less by the rural push. So I think in all these three cases, the general trend that we see either through the Gini or the GIC or even the top and bottom consumption shares is that urban inequality is driving the aggregate national aggregate picture, and that's something important for us. The main trends, I think the consumption survey data by design, as I mentioned earlier, are top coded, but they give a fairly good representative picture, unlike the tax data, especially in the case of India, where the number of taxpayers are quite small and it's highly skewed to the top 1 to 10%. So in that sense, the consumption data is quite a fairly good representative picture in our view. So what does it basically suggest? I mean, some of the broad things that we see is that there is obviously a decline in aggregate poverty. There's a relatively low rise in consumption Gini, but relative, as we saw in the China and in Indonesia comparison, where both China and Indonesia are probably cyclical, but in India's case, it is more stable. And the bulk of gains in the upper tails are concentrated on the upper tails of the top decile. Rural India, as we mentioned, appears much less equal than urban India. And it's also important to, in this context, also important to understand the population dynamic, where the percentage of population in urban India has significantly increased over a period of time, from the 1980s onwards till about 2011. And the percentage of urban to rural deciles has been increasing from about 30% to almost about 45 to 46%. So that's an important background also to the increase in urban, the importance of urban inequality dynamic to the overall inequality picture. This brings us to our one of the core parts of our discussion, which is essentially the role of location and the locational variation in living standards. We find that is quite large. For example, according to 2011-12 data, per capita income in Bihar, for example, is about 30% of the same for Delhi. And this is significant because you find a lot of people going from Bihar, an outflow of migrants to cities like Delhi. And I think this is even applicable to many other cities, whether it's Chennai, whether it's Mumbai, or even Bangalore. You find that folks who are in areas with lower per capita income tend to move towards areas which has higher per capita income, primarily because of greater opportunity in those areas. And coincidentally, most of them tend to be urban-centric centers. Just to give some context, this within the country variation is actually also similar in magnitude to per capita incomes, PPP adjusted, in both the United States versus India. India is about around 10% of the United States. So the migration dynamic, albeit being internal, still the trend of going to a place with higher opportunity seems to be also resonating here. We come to the key question: how can this be explained by location? And now we will move on to the Milanovic model, which based on which our regression or models have been adapted, and Rishabh will give some details on the next couple of slides before I come back on the DBT section.
Yeah, okay, can I share my screen?
Yeah, you can do that, or can you use this? So you want me to just run the slides as you speak?
No, I got it. It's just starting.
Okay.
Just a second.
So should we pause for comments at this stage, or?
Yeah, I think that's okay. That's okay. That's fine.
Sure. Yeah.
So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to post them on the chat window. Shriram, can you see the chat window?
Yeah, I can see it. I see the question from Dhruv Goel. Can I answer that right now?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So yes, the question says the marginal propensity to consume for the rich is much less than that for the poor, which is absolutely true. This is something actually we mentioned in the paper as well. This is what it's not. The consumption survey is not exactly a picture of income inequality. The person who asked the question, Dhruv, is right. I mean, the idea is not to look at income inequality, but actually just variation in living standards across India that is better represented by a consumption, that is how much people spend on a month-to-month basis. Consumption inequality by design is always lower than income inequality because of variation in the marginal propensity to consume and the average propensity to consume, which kind of tails off as you go into the upper tails of the income distribution. But the problem is that we don't have income tax data to study that kind of variation. Not just income tax data, but there's no income survey in India that's conducted that can give us an idea about something like this. And as we'll see, actually, that's not our focus. Our focus is not so much on inequality and the evolution of inequality. There's a lot of inequality in India. If we were to convert from a consumption to income Gini, it would probably jump up to double what it is right now. But the focus is slightly different. And as I enter the slides, you'll see why this is the case. So I hope that answers the question. For now, the rest in the slides, I'll try to answer.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, great. So thank you, Rishabh. Yeah, you can continue.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, are my slides showing up?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just go back to some of these slides to just contextualize a few things for the rest of the analysis. So the first thing is that since the 1980s, if you notice, India is the blue line over here. India is the blue line, China is the red line, and Indonesia is the green line. Now we've split this into three patterns. The lower one here is the national aggregate, that's for the entire country, but there we've also split, I mean, we also have division by rural and urban Gini coefficients. Now, I mean, this is exactly what Dhruv said. In India, it seems like inequality is not too high if you look at only consumption surveys. Now, this is primarily because the very rich do not necessarily consume much more than the rich who do not consume much more than the slightly rich, whereas the income differences might be much larger. But if you notice in this, India actually has a very stable progression in its Gini. The data are less frequent because they rely on the NSSO surveys, which are not on an annual basis. But if you look at this, India basically appears to be quite stable. The evolution of inequality seems to be quite stable in evolution of consumption inequality between the 1980s and the present decade. Whereas in China and in Indonesia, the patterns are quite turbulent. So for example, you see China, rural China, during their high growth phase, inequality in rural China increased substantially and then falls around 2010. Whereas their urban inequality is quite stable, it's rising up. In Indonesia, on the other hand, you see that rural inequality actually goes down and then comes up. Not the same in India. See, it's quite stable. It's almost at 0.3 for the entire duration. And if you think about it, much of India's economic growth is urban-centric. It basically generates growth in urban parts. So it makes sense that there's not such an increase in rural India. And in fact, if anything, it's kind of stagnated in a sense. But the driver of aggregate inequality or the aggregate consumption inequality in India is basically similar to the urban factor. So what I'm trying to say is that when we think of overall inequality in India, the urban section of inequality is actually driving this portion, not so much the rural part. This is quite significant because, as Shriram showed earlier in one of our charts, that the urban population is growing. So what happens in urban India will, if inequality at an early stage was being determined by the urban distribution, then in later stages, as the urban population grows, this is going to become more and more salient in the data. Now, the growth incidence curve here is basically, this is all in PPP terms from POFCALNet, the World Bank's consumption and income survey database. If you look at these growth incidence curves, what these are telling you is for any decile, which is described here, how much growth there was between 1983 and 2011. So we're talking about before liberalization and well after liberalization. So the basic idea is, where was the growth of consumption, aggregate consumption, distributed? The Gini is a relative measure. We don't really see if the poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer, or the poor are getting richer. But with the GIC, you can see growth at different deciles or fractiles of the consumption distribution. So any point here represents for one of these divisions, national, rural, and urban, it represents basically the growth, annual rate of growth between 1983 and 2011-12 for one of these deciles, each of these deciles from 1 to 10. So the top, the 10th decile is basically people between the 90th and top of the distribution, and over here you have the poorest decile. So these are the poorest 10% of India's population. And the picture here suggests that, firstly, at the aggregate level, there's quite a bit of growth at the top, comparatively speaking. I mean, it stands out in this figure. This is, of course, a matter of scale as well, but it seems to be quite well distributed. So this seems to give the picture that growth has kind of raised all boats together. And in effect, what we're seeing is a decline in rural poverty, which is quite well documented in the literature. Significant decline in rural poverty, at least until the 4th decile, and stabilization thereafter, and actually not that much growth in the urban lower deciles. So just remember, these are anonymous, so we're not tracking the same people over say 20, 30 years. What we're doing is actually is looking at specific deciles over 2 periods of time, and this is kind of giving us a picture about what's happened there. And as Shriram previously mentioned, basically consumption shares are stable in rural India, or actually even declining at the top, but the national and the urban top shares of consumption are going up over time. So let me come to this question of variation. Now, what we know is that from this is that rural India poverty may have declined. Again, I'm saying may, we don't know for sure, but it may have declined, and seems to have stabilized. The inequality seems to have stabilized in rural India, not the same in urban India. What this implies is that we will basically have a huge distribution of living standards across India. So you have poor rural states and you have rich urban states, and then you have a mix of both of those. So this is just, this slide here is just meant to give an idea of the degree of variation. Now, one of the main factors on global inequality is the equality of opportunity, which means that a person can migrate from one part to the other. That scale is defined by poor and rich countries, but within India, we find the same kind of scale. That is, if you live in Bihar and you earn the average income in Bihar, then your income is about 13% of the average income of someone in Delhi. And this is more or less the same comparison as what we see between India and the United States. So someone in India on average has an income which is 10% of the income of someone on average in the United States. So taking this within India, the question is how much of this variation within India, the fact that there are people in the poorer rural deciles to the richer urban deciles, how much of this variation can be explained using location? So the main model that was used to assess this is actually by Branko Milanovic in a very well known paper from the Review of Economics and Statistics in 2015. So Milanovic, basically what he wanted to do was pool everyone in the world into one data set and assess how much inequality you can explain based on country of residence and inequality within that country. So basically using per capita income of that country as a public good that everyone has to, everyone in a sense gets in that country, and inequality, which tells us the dispersion of that income in that country, he found that he was able to explain more than 50% of a person's income or consumption based on just these two factors alone. What this says is that if location, which no one, which is a circumstance that you cannot really control on your own, if location is so significant in the sense that it gives us a certain amount of, it scales up per capita income, and it gives us a dispersion of those incomes through inequality, if that alone explains more than 50% of your income or consumption, then effort plays a lower role in life. Effort and luck actually play a lower role in life than global inequality, which means you can simply by moving from one country to another, you can actually improve your living standards much more than putting in the effort in your own country, in basically trying to improve your income levels staying in the same country. So what we've done is we've applied this to the within country context, that is only within India. Question is, how important is location in the Indian context? That is, how much does it matter whether you live in urban Delhi versus rural Bihar or rural Andhra Pradesh? Remember that in India, we don't even have these issues of migration costs associated with migration, in the sense that it's costless. There's no passport, there's no restriction, you can move from one part to the other. So the role of these kinds of circumstances is likely, if it's large enough, then that has enormous implications for something like economic migrations. And if you think about it, if it does make such a huge impact, then is it worth expending effort to improve your income staying in the same location when you can simply migrate? And as an economic migrant, you might gain more in your living standards without expending that kind of effort. So the process is basically a confluence of two forces. The first is that urban India is growing. Okay, so incomes in urban India are growing, but they're growing unequally. So they're driving aggregate inequality. The second thing to think about is that this is potentially some kind of a Kuznets-Lewis type process where there's a traditional sector and then there's a sector, and a higher drawing wage in the urban sector or the modern sector pulls people towards it from the traditional sector. So what we did was that we took everyone in India, in a sense, through microdata. We took everyone in India and we tried to estimate how much of their consumption, which is given here, the log of their consumption, can be explained based on the GDP, per capita GDP of their state, which is basically a proxy for their living for the average income in the state, but also for the level of industrialization in the state and the gains from growth in that state, and the Gini coefficient, that is the level of inequality in that state. So both of these are two locational variables, and we want to know how much, if we were to look at everyone in India, how much of their living standards would be, and the variation in these living standards would we be able to explain based on just these two factors alone. Okay. It's important to think about this in terms of exogeneity and endogeneity, because each person here is an individual that cannot change single-handedly cannot change the GDP of their state, and hence cannot influence per capita income of that state. Single-handedly, they cannot change the Gini of their state. They can single-handedly, the things that they can do is get more education, exert more effort, or be gifted with luck. But what we're doing is avoiding those things. We're saying that that's a separate part. We don't want to look at those. We want to capture those as a residual and only focus on these aggregate circumstances, locational circumstances. That's why you see this is I here, the index I, subscript I here indicates that this is one person. J over here is the state that that person is located in. So the individual level circumstances do not at all show up in our equation. So when we estimated this exactly as given, the equation exactly as given, we use national accounting data, national accounts data for 2011-12 to get per capita incomes, and the Gini we've computed for every state using microdata. So when we estimate this, the results show that basically we can explain about 18% of the variation in living standards based on state location. So if everyone was only given the per capita income of their state and the inequality in their state, and you compared every Indian, you find that you can explain 18% of the differences in their living standards proxied by consumption by these two factors. Interestingly, we see that so this factor here is the elasticity of consumption. So this tells you what happens when the per capita income of your state goes up by 1 rupee, how much your consumption goes up by. So this elasticity is about 50%, 54%, which says that if you move from one state to another, you, depending on the difference in income, if you move to a richer state, your consumption or your living standards will go up by half. So fairly significant elasticity, but inequality plays no role. So in terms of significance, this factor makes no statistical significance to your living standards. But on the other hand, what we do is we replace all of these purely by state dummy. So instead, there's no variables at all. All we have is a least square dummy variable model where we, for every individual is regressed on dummy, which is their state. And we find that at this point, based on location alone, we're able to explain about 25% or a quarter of the variation in living standards. So very high. So just based on a person's location, in a state-based location, you can explain 25% of the variation in their living standards, which is fairly high. Branko Milanovic was able to explain 70%, and that 70% of global inequality based on this exact equation. Now, of course, global inequality, so this, because of these countries getting pooled together, it's much more likely that this equation explains global inequality. But even for India, 25% is very large, keeping in mind that there are important factors which explain why a person's living standard differs, like caste, like religion, like gender, like education levels, those factors which are specific to the individual. We've ignored those and still we're able to explain about 25%. Now, what we do is we modify this and we go to more granular model. So the same equation we regress, but now in each state, instead of everyone listed on an aggregate basis, we divide the population of every state equally into rural and urban parts of that state. So what we've done is the entire consumption distribution is distributed between 100 percentiles of the urban distribution, 100 percentiles of the rural distribution. And we've replaced the state Gini with another Gini, which is the subsector Gini. That is, the Gini now represents the level of inequality in the urban or the rural part of that state, depending on where that person is located. So with this equation, we find that we're able to explain about 17, 18%. So that doesn't change much. The level of explanation doesn't change much. The elasticity is still positive. So if you move to a richer state, your consumption goes up automatically. It's highly significant. But now we find that once we granularize the data at this level, that the state sector Gini now becomes very significant and enters positively. So what this is saying is that if you have the option to move to an equal or an unequal part, you should move to an unequal part because that will raise your living standards much more than staying in a more equal part. And this is quite striking when you think about it. What this is saying is that if you have an option to move or to migrate, the place you should choose to migrate should have, given same levels of per capita income, you'll actually gain more from moving to an unequal state than you will to an equal state. Again, this time we replace all the variables by just state sector dummies. That is, for every state, we have two dummies, an urban dummy and a rural dummy. We now find that we're able to explain almost 1/3 of the total variation in living standards in India based on the dummy-based model. So fairly high. So about 1/3 of variation in living standards in India can basically be explained by location. And why is this? Well, this is because, as we showed before in these stylized facts, that there's been kind of a dispersion in the way inequality has evolved in rural versus urban India. At both state and sector level, a person can improve their living standards by moving to a richer state. This is fairly expected, that if you want to improve your living standard, go to a richer state with your ability, with your skills, whatever, you are able to earn a lot more in that state. This is like saying that if you're an engineer in Bihar, you will probably gain more income and live at a higher level, consumption level, if you move to Delhi, because Delhi has higher per capita income. But what is important is that at the state level, inequality plays no role. It's insignificant. The Gini coefficient does not have any statistical significance, but at the state sector level, it becomes highly significant and is positive. So a person can improve their living standards by moving to a more unequal region. So if you're that same engineer and you're in Bihar versus if you could choose to go to Bombay, which is more unequal, you will gain more in your living standards. This is basically counter to what we see in global inequality, because the gap between countries is decreasing, but inequality within countries is increasing. What Branko Milanovic found is actually that global inequality actually lowers your living standards. So in this case, we see that that's not the case. So within India, the dynamics are slightly different. If you think of India as a set of 32 countries within one geographical region, we find opposite trends here. When we replaced our model with just location, we found that we were able to explain between 25% to 30%, depending on whether we stick to the state model or the state sector model. So we also ran these models at the level of deciles. So comparing the poor in the first decile across India. And in this case, we're able to explain between 50% to 80% of the variation in living standards without using any dummies, just based on state per capita GDP and inequality in that state. So the basic takeaway from all this is that a person can actually gain from sacrificing their class. That is, if you're in the 50th decile in some part of the country, whether it's rural, urban, whatever state it is, you can actually gain more from dropping down the deciles if you move to a richer state. So we compared the probability distributions of both urban and rural India, and you can see why we're starting to see the results in this case. So the urban distribution, which is the green plot over here, has a very, very long tail, comparatively speaking. That tail almost phase shifts the entire distribution away from rural India. So you're seeing that there's the mean, the median, the mode, all of these for rural India are well behind urban India. So you basically, everyone around these points, everyone who is above these points can gain more from dropping down from here to here, because that puts, I mean, dropping down from this distribution to this distribution basically opens up this entire range of possibilities, which is a lot more than what you see in rural India. And on top, all the measures of central tendency for urban India are higher. Now that's the rural and urban comparison. Now, if you think about the lack of convergence in GDP per capita between these states, we can see the other driving factor. That is that the top 5 states, which are ranked in 2004 and taken till 2013, the top 5 states have actually grown almost a percentage faster than the rest of the states. So not only does it matter that the rural distribution is much more compact than the urban distribution, but depending on which of these states you're in, if you're in the top 5 states, you're pulling away even further from the distribution. So both these factors are basically driving away the distribution for you. And when we actually make growth incidence curves for the 2004 to 11 phase, which is the fastest growth phase for India, we see that what's happened is a reshuffling of the urban and rural classes. So what we had shown earlier in the long run GIC curve is a basic decline in poverty, kind of growth for everyone in rural India, growth for everyone on an aggregate basis, and some concentration in the tail. Now, when we do this only for this specific phase, 2004 to 2011, we see exactly what's been going on. And remember, this is all despite MG and Rega in rural India. So what we see is that there's actually, if you were poor in urban India, your gains are actually much higher than they would have been in rural India if you were in the same class. So if you compare someone in the 4th decile of rural India, they have actually gained less than someone in the 4th decile of urban India. In fact, the urban poor have actually gained more than the same decile at the national level and the rural level. So what we're seeing is that it was better for you to be in the lower urban class than to be in the in the lower to middle class of rural India. So these gains are higher than almost all these other portions. And of course, if you were rich in urban India, you had the highest gains. That's not necessarily interesting. That is kind of well defined. But this is striking for us because what we see is in this period where there is a concerted scheme to make rural India, living standards in India rise through job guarantee scheme, Despite all of this, the gains are actually driven more by a Lewis type process here, which makes the migrant class that comes from rural India to urban India gain more than their equivalent ranks in rural India. So this was fairly striking as an explanation of what we saw. Anyway, to conclude from this part, what we've seen is that in a country where caste, where inheritance, where gender are vital, where the level of education is vital, because of the lack of convergence in states, states have industrialized at different rates and at different levels. And the fact that rural India has stayed relatively less unequal, but also stagnant, while urban India has kind of been more dynamic, become more unequal, but has also grown more. We can explain 25 to 30% of total variation in living standards in India for everyone, basically, based on just this location factor, something that an individual cannot change because it's not specific to them. Basic point is you can't change. So you have the choice. You can either decide to study much more and try to raise your living standard, or you can just choose to move from one location to another. And that might actually make a bigger difference in your life, in your living standards and your family living standards than necessarily expending effort. Obviously, effort matters a lot, and effort is a great explanation. But for a country with so many factors that explain a person's living standard, the fact that location is so important is quite striking. It explains why migration is it never slows down, hasn't slowed down at any point in the last 15 to 20 years. So the flow of migrants from poor to rich parts is about 9 million on an annual basis. And in 2017, according to the economic survey, the stock of migrants across India was about 139 million, which is fairly high, especially when you consider that sometimes only the head of the household migrates. That's a fairly large number. So based on the GIC curve that I just showed before, the other important point is that in India, it makes sense for a person to trade class for location. Location is more important for them at the same class on a comparative basis. It's better for them to drop out of the middle class of rural India to the urban class of lower urban class in India. And that actually makes a bigger difference to their living standard. So I'll stop here and Sriram will continue from here.
Sure. Thanks, Rishabh. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Thanks, Rishabh. In continuation of what Rishabh had mentioned, especially on the issue of location, much of the data that we have dealt with was still the 2011-12 phase, and a lot of the transformative changes, as he mentioned, though Manrega was a huge catalyst for the rural sector, one of the more transformative things post 2012 has been the DBT direct benefit transfer exercise in terms of a process. This graph basically gives you an indication of how much DBT has evolved over the years. And the advantage with I think DBT is that it is very targeted at the lower decile levels. In the GIC curve, which Rishabh had explained earlier, we would see at either the first or second decile levels much of the transfers going at the lower decile levels. And because of the fact that it's been done digitally, it has improves a lot of efficiency in terms of the transfers. So this has had is likely to have a impact on recent trends. So if you look at the graph here, there's been almost a 30 or 45 times increase in terms of transfers from about 7,368 crores in about 2013-14 when the scheme really started in traction to about almost 330,000 crores in 2018-19. That's almost a 45 times increase in DBT transfers. Primarily, this is because of one, an acceleration of the JAM integration, Jan Dhan Yojana, Aadhaar, and mobile. They have been accelerated significantly, and also the improvements in efficiency in the DBT program, which you also highlight in the paper. Obviously, we're also cognizant of some of the challenges in terms of the Aadhaar seeding, And in terms of the effectiveness of transfers, in some cases, we are also cognizant of that. But in this case, we just wanted to showcase the data, the officially available data, so as to take that in our analysis. And last point is that there have been also some savings to the government to identify fake and overlapping accounts. I think in the initial phase of DBT, this was less done in a smaller manner, but I think more and more, there's been improvement in this regard. In terms of schemes, if just to give you an overview of some of these schemes over the time period, much of the transfers has been dominated by Manrega, especially from the 2013-15 phase to about 16-17 phase. And in recent years, there have been a greater diversification with the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana taking more dominance in terms of the transfers. For example, if you look at the blue line, the blue graph represents Manrega's contribution to overall DBT from 2013 till 17. And in 17-18, the contribution is probably lesser. And with, say, schemes the Awas Yojana, which is the yellow box, which has gained a bit more traction. And in recent times, the component of others has increased, meaning more miscellaneous schemes which have come up and have been accelerated through the DBT, and also things like the PAL scheme and the centrally sponsored schemes as well. So this is broadly the evolution of, I think, the schemes in DBT, where we see greater diversification in recent years compared to previous years, and obviously increase in quantum of transfers that's being made over a period of time. It's important to know that 2019-20 figure, one of the reasons why it's lower is because we're just taking between April and December. That's the data that's available. Obviously, the rest of the few months, it's still not available, and some of it has been focused on COVID, which, like I showed in the earlier graph, there is a certain component which has been already given for COVID till in the last few months. So probably a better sense of the 2019-20 figure will be, when we see the data in June, that will give us a better sense. But the broader theme is that there's been more diversification, more targeting, and more increase of these DBT transfers. If you look at the data by DBT per states, this is in USD millions. What you see is that the various states, the top 5 states in each of the years, for example, in 2016-17, was Bengal, Tamil Nadu, and Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Andhra Pradesh were the top 5 states in terms of DBT transfers, and their per capita incomes are quite different. For example, a state with a low per capita income like Uttar Pradesh gaining a lot of the DBT transfers in both 16-17 as well as 17-18. Whereas on the other hand, a state like Tamil Nadu, which is my home state, which has a fairly higher per capita income, there is also a high amount of DBT transfers done. So what we are seeing is that the relationship between per capita income and the amount of transfers isn't necessarily straightforward. A variety of factors impact it. It could be the infrastructure that is available, could be the percentage of population of poor in that particular state, or it could be even the political considerations in that particular state with regard to the political economy issues. So a diverse set of factors seem to be at play in terms of which of the states are receiving the transfers and which of the states are not receiving. But the interesting thing is all of this is again targeted at the lower segment. So it's bound to have an impact at the lower decile levels. And that's what we see in general trends. This is a cumulative graph on the amount of savings. Again, this is what we get from the government data. Probably a bit more due diligence needs to be done on this to kind of check the veracity of this. But prima facie, from what we're seeing, there has been substantive savings in terms of some of these schemes. For example, the PAL scheme, the PDS scheme, and the Manrega scheme, in terms of efficiency gains essentially what we mean by efficiency gains is less leakages, transfers going directly to the person's bank account, to the individual's bank account, and less corruption in the supply chain process of transferring the money. So we're seeing quite a bit of savings, in these schemes as per the DBT's data. Moving on to COVID, I think we gave a context on DBT, and DBT has been transformative from the 2012 to 18 phase in terms of a big scheme and an impact at the rural level. Moving on to COVID, I think the impact, at least at the macro level, has been pretty significant. If you look at the capital flows data, perhaps the Chinese data is a bit camouflaging the rest, but India's reduction in flows has been pretty significant, similar to the taper tantrum of, say, 2013, and perhaps even the GFC, the global financial crisis earlier. And so we see a significant reduction in flows from the capital market side. In terms of the DBT support, as I mentioned earlier, the much of the government's package of support in terms of the purely monetary side rather than the liquidity measures has been routed through the DBT system. If you take, for example, the centrally supported schemes, they have accumulated to about approximately 30,000 crores. The statewide schemes is about 10,000 crores. And Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, which is, I think, the pioneering tool for the transfers, is about 35,000 crores. So the cumulative on the x-axis, on the y-axis on the right-hand side, it gives a list of beneficiaries. The total number of beneficiaries is about 50 to 60 crores. So much of the transfers or the fiscal or the direct transfer support provided has been through the DBT exercise, at least during the COVID phase. So what are the implications for this in terms of the trends that we see in our analysis? I think one thing that is significant is that we see that the lockdown basically reverses the basic structural feature regarding circumstances, which Rishabh articulated quite well in the earlier section. When you shut down the urban economy, it creates a return to the rural India where living standards are lower, especially for the migrating class. So since the DBT types of schemes are mostly focused on rural, that toward the lower decile level of rural, they may be unable to solve the conundrum of the migrant stock. So the rural economy might be a bit more buffered because of these type of transfers, assuming that these transfers are efficient and effective, and assuming that they're reaching the right people with that alibi in place. Another interesting thing that we also see is that the resumption in the context of the role of location that we mentioned, and what our data, what our regression analysis shows us, where 30% of the movement, above 30%, is primarily due to location. We see that kind of resonating here as well, in the sense when you look at the immediate resumption of passenger to urban India after the end of the lockdown. So lots of folks have actually returned back to their centers, despite the anxiety and despite the conundrum of COVID still being quite significant. So what we basically see is people feel that despite the uncertainty around, the need for greater economic opportunity, the need to go to back to the urban cluster to enjoy better living standards is far more outweighing than the caution of staying in their rural homes, despite the health uncertainty. So this, I think, reinforces the premium of enjoying better living standards in urban areas, and it reinforces some of the trends that we see in the NSSO surveys that and some of the analysis that we have done. So in conclusion, I think what we're trying to showcase through the presentation and our research is that one, we see that urban inequality is playing a role in driving the aggregate inequality In India, we're seeing that about 30% of the more than 30% can be explained through locational determinants for inequality in India, and also the recent trends in say DBT, direct benefit transfers, and also the resumption of passenger traffic back to India back to urban India seems to indicate that these trends are driven more by location and opportunity in urban areas than other factors. So I think this kind of wraps up the presentation, and we'll be glad to take some questions.
So thank you for the presentation. We have a couple of questions on the chat window. Sriram, would you like me to read them? Would you like me to read them out, or you can actually see the questions?
I'm not able to see it, but Rishabh, are you able to see the questions?
Yes, I can see them.
I think you have to click on the chat button.
Yeah. Okay.
I can see the question.
Okay, Rishabh, would you like to answer the questions?
Yeah, so I'll take them sequentially. So since Karen asked, since consumption equality is less in rural areas, can we reduce that there is less standard of living required or less opportunity? It's a good question. I think it's a combination of both, because opportunity will more or less will determine the spread of the distribution, but the standard of living required will be captured by the center of the distribution or the mean of the consumption distribution. I think it's obviously both. So the standard of living required is low, but I think the distribution is more or less constrained, or it's quite tight around it. T.S. Ramakrishnan asks, how does your study take the consumption of migrant labor whose income is less spent on the state where they earn and more spent on the state where they transfer their major portion of income? So about remittances, I think, again, very good question. I think the important thing is that, in a sense, our model is showing why those remittances happen. That is why a person goes from, say, rural India to urban India, because the overall, and remember, we only explain 30% of the variation in income, but because even if they want to make those remittances, whatever surplus they want to accumulate in excess has to come from getting the higher income and hence higher level of spending in the urban portion. And this is not the only, obviously not the only thing. I mean, there are also rich people in rural India, but I'm saying that, yes, this is an important factor in probably also determining the level of remittances. I mean, if people were to stay back in rural India, there would be no question of remittances in this case. In the rise of the urban lower class, the difference is just 0.25%, which is very insignificant. It is, you're right that the scale makes it seem larger than it actually is, but actually we've used deflated both trends based on their specific CPIs. There's a rural CPI, there's a urban CPI, and what you're talking about, of course, in terms of the composition of consumption bundles, yeah, that does make a difference, I would assume. But over a period of 7 years, that still amounts to about a 1.8% difference in standards for both. No need to include the latest figure. Yeah, I think Sriram can answer this part better. With transport facilities, especially few train services, how the authors say that immediate resumption of transport to urban areas immediately after the lockdown. Yeah, I mean, this is a good point. I'm definitely not trying to say that there's an immediate, everything is back to normal. Obviously, it's not. What I'm trying to say is that if with the spread of a pandemic, the fact that the moment the reverse trains were started, they were immediately full and they started to show reverse traffic very quickly. This was an article that was published by Ila Patnaik a few days ago, which is what I'm referring to. It just shows that ultimately the level of opportunity in rural India and the living standard offered in the long run is too low for them to stay in that place. Not necessarily I mean, immediately after the fate of the rural migrants was a major topic of news, international news, as we've all heard. But Srinivas and Jain of NDTV did a story. You know, he went to rural India, to Bihar, actually to my ancestral village, so I could see. quite well. I mean, he was talking to a lot of the returned migrants, and he was discussing their main problems. And their main problem is not so much the pandemic, because they're used to living in without healthcare anyways. What was very important was for them was that they came back. They said, after this trip, there's nothing left here for us, and I mean, there's no job. The moment the train opens up, we're going back. We have no option here, and it just shows basically the stagnant nature of many parts of rural India, not necessarily all of all rural India. There are specific portions, UP and Bihar, which are transferring bulk of the flow from to these urban centers. So I would say that's where it makes a similar comparison.
Just one point, Rishabh, just to add to what you said. I think it's also, I think, a sense of priorities, say, for the folks in rural India, that despite a COVID kind of situation, that the higher priority is the opportunity and the income. And because they can't do anything there and they're already used to it, they're willing to take that risk and go ahead. So such is the incentive for them to, seems to be for them to make a move back. And on the point of the data, I'll just quickly make, since it's the same thread, I agree that the data for the whole year is available, but the split between the COVID and, because the COVID came in the last few months, and so the split has been given from April to December, and the January part of it is still not there. So that is something, we would make sure that it's updated as the full data set comes through from the government on this. Yeah.
I want to add one point. Is it okay?
Yeah.
So this is regarding migrant laborers. So actually the pattern of migrant laborers is like this. They work actually, because I am also from the state of Tamil Nadu. So I have observed the migrant laborers, especially in Tirupur and other areas. So now what they normally do is they come here and work for say 5-6 months, and then they go back and stay in their home villages for 2 months, and then again they will come back again for another 6 months. So basically, when they are living in the state to which they have migrated, they wanted to work. They don't want to remain idle. If they want to remain idle, they wanted to be at their home and enjoy a comfortable life. So when lockdown happened, they were asked to stay back because they were forced to stay back, and that actually, created a lot of frustration among themselves, because this is the time for their home, not for on a working spot. So I'm very much sure that once COVID is over, so people will start migrating towards urban centers, because the income is much better compared to their rural income.
So just to address the last question, does the study have similarities with the study of Raj Chetty of Harvard, which says there's a significant rise in income if one may? No, I think it's very different. Firstly, Raj Chetty is using the microdata, which can track the same individual over their entire lifespans. And it is, what he says is that the level of opportunity is predicted to be higher from moving to a poor to rich neighborhood because of better educational opportunities and things like that. So I don't think it's the same, because in the United States, what Raj Chetty found is places that are not necessarily urban centers actually have a better lifetime outcome than places in urban centers. The worst in America are Oakland, New York City, Atlanta, and Chicago. So they have the worst outcome. So if to begin with, with India, it's not the same at all. But the important thing is that Raj Chetty is able to track the same individual from the time they're born and their dependents all the time to the point where they turn 33 years old, and he's able to track them. So no, this is not at all the same thing. If we could do that, that would be one of the greatest pieces of research in India. If you could track the same individual from the 1980s to 2010, but there's no social security numbers in India. At least they weren't back then, at least.
So are there any other questions? Yeah, please go ahead.
No, I was just giving an added comment to what you're saying. If that data was available, it will be probably the most significant, I think, research item on the subject for many years.
Yeah, very true. So are there any other questions from the audience?
Just one comment, Satish here.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Satish here. Hi, Shriram.
Hi, Satish. Nice to see you.
Good. So just one observation, when people move from rural to urban, of course, I think one of the diagrams that you were showing, when people move, they are less conscious about their class status when they migrate to urban cities. So therefore, I think one of your diagrams nicely shows that in rural areas, I'm more conscious about my class or status. But once I move to the urban cities, I may be in a lower decile, but my growth, consumption growth is much higher. And therefore, that's what I prefer. So that class distinction is not there in urban. I think that might be driving part of the story. Just a comment, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that also plays a role in the locational premium, in the sense once these classifications kind of dilute, then they're more liberated to do what they want. So I think that also that there is distinction of, or the dilution of class plays an important role when they move.
You know, ultimately what matters is, I mean, the concept of class is a synthetic thing that we've put in terms of rural and urban class. I mean, ultimately a person is moving up in a sense, they are conscious of where they're moving at the national level. So a person moves from the middle class in rural India to the lower class of urban India, still is moving from the lower class to the urban class within India. So the ultimate determinant of living standards and opportunity is for them an aggregate sense of class, as opposed to I would say the subsector. That is for us an econometric tool, I guess, or a useful classification.
So thank you, Satish. Any other questions from the audience? So if there's no other questions, I think we'll wrap up the presentation. So I'd like to give a round of thanks to all the speakers, to Shriram, to Rishabh, and to Dr. Langani. So it was a very interesting presentation, and I think all of us